At that Christmas dinner, under the dazzling golden lights reflecting off crystal glasses and the cheerful chatter of relatives, my mother suddenly turned to me, looked me straight in the eye, and said the words I will never forget, "You are the most useless child I have." The air around the table shattered instantly. Forks and knives froze midair, conversations died away, leaving behind a heavy silence pressing down on my chest like a boulder. I sat there, frozen, feeling as if someone had just crushed my heart right in front of the whole family. It wasn't just an insult, it was the final blow to years of futile attempts to earn recognition. Welcome to Family Ashes, where family secrets burn to ashes, but the one telling the story still rises from the wreckage, carrying both the scars and the strength to speak the truth. I tell this story not to complain, but to remind you that sometimes the deepest fractures in a family don't come from outsiders, but from the very hands that are supposed to be closest. So what would you do, if your own mother chose to humiliate you in front of everyone? Would you swallow the pain in silence, let things continue as if nothing had happened, or would you stand up and turn the whole table upside down with truths they've always tried to bury? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more family drama stories like this, stories that are both painful and awakening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so you won't miss the next journey of Family Ashes. My name is Jessica Miller, 34 years old, living in Denver, Colorado, a city where the winters are always blanketed with snow, but inside me it has never felt warm. I work as a marketing manager for a media company, a job many in my family dismiss because it doesn't come with a white coat or make headlines in court. But I know how many years I've poured into it, the nights I stayed behind after the office went dark, the weekend mornings I skipped coffee with friends just to finish a campaign. No one in my family has ever asked me what I actually do. They brush it aside, call it temporary work, as if every effort I've made isn't worth mentioning. By my side is Brian, 36, a high school history teacher. To my mother, he is just a man with a steady paycheck but not nearly successful enough. To me, he is an entire world, patient, attentive, someone who has never once made me feel like I had to compete for affection. With him, I know I am seen, I am loved, without having to prove a thing. And then there is my family, picture perfect, at least from the outside. My mother, Margaret, always stern, her voice carrying both command and judgment. My brother, Daniel, a surgeon in Houston, is her eternal pride, mentioned and praised at every meal, in every conversation. My sister, Emily, a lawyer in Chicago, has been coddled since childhood, forgiven for mistakes that, if they had been mine, would have been branded as failures. In that house, all the light was poured onto them, while I, the middle child, learned to sit quietly on the margins, watching every ounce of attention, every word of praise, every warm embrace pass me by. Growing up in that family was like living inside a theater where I was only ever allowed to play a blurry supporting role. I could shout, raise my hand, throw myself into every task just to prove I mattered, but when the curtain fell, the applause always went to Daniel and Emily. I taught myself to quietly step off stage, to swallow everything, and to cling to the hope that one day, my mother would finally turn and look at me differently. But that day never came. Daniel was always placed on the highest pedestal, a living testament to the dream my mother bragged about to the world. When he won a state academic award, she wrote letters to every relative, as if she herself had triumphed. When he was accepted into medical school, the family threw a huge party, relatives filled the house, laughter spilling out onto the porch. I sat in the corner, listening to her repeat the same sentence, "My son will become a surgeon, saving thousands of lives." Each time she said it, her eyes shone with pride, while I felt myself fading further into the shadow cast by his brilliance. Daniel only had to breathe and he was praised. A short article mentioning his name could dominate family conversations for weeks. Meanwhile, my good grades, my long hours working part-time, were nothing but faint echoes that disappeared into the void. Emily was a different story, but no less bitter. She was always wrapped up like something fragile that might break. I still remember one time she drove a car before she was old enough and scratched up the door of my mother's new car. Instead of scolding her, my mother pulled her into her arms and said softly, "You're still young, you'll learn from this." I stood there, my mouth hanging open in shock. If it had been me, I would have been called irresponsible and locked in my room for a week to reflect. Emily could fail a class and be comforted with, "It's okay, you'll do better next time." I, on the other hand, had to earn straight A's, anything less was met immediately with her cold, disappointed gaze. Emily could break a vase, lie about going out, or shirk house chores for her own pleasures, and it was always brushed off with, "She's still young, don't be hard on her." I was never allowed to be still young. I was never allowed to make mistakes. In that family, Daniel was the pride, Emily was the jewel, and I was only the invisible point of comparison, existing solely so my mother could remind me that there were children more worthy than me. And slowly, I learned to swallow everything, to turn myself into the faded background of the portrait my mother loved to show off, a portrait with two radiant figures, and one shadow no one wanted to notice. Since I was 16, I worked part-time at a small bookstore down the street. Not because my family needed the money, but because I thought if I could support myself and even buy gifts for my mother, she would look at me differently. I tucked every small paycheck into envelopes, saving for weeks just to buy her a bouquet of fresh flowers on Mother's Day, or the silver earrings I had stared at in a jewelry shop window. I still remember the summer I worked nonstop just to afford a silk scarf in the store, the one she had once said looked nice. My hands trembled when I gave it to her, hoping it would make her smile. And she did smile, but only for a minute, before boasting that Daniel had bought her a bottle of perfume far more worthy, and Emily had given her a dress, even though she'd bought it in a rush at the last minute. I stood there, my hands empty, feeling all my effort crumble into dust. But I didn't stop. In college, I studied and worked as a tutor, even took extra shifts at a coffee shop to save money, hoping that one day my family would be proud of me for standing on my own feet. I graduated with a high GPA, got into a competitive internship program, and later finished school with praise from my professors. Yet whenever I called home to share the good news, it was brushed off with something flat. "Oh, that's fine. Did you hear Daniel just published another research paper, or Emily just won a big case, everyone's talking about it." No one noticed that I was moving forward too, that my achievements were no less significant. It felt like running a marathon, pouring sweat until I was empty, only to find no one waiting at the finish line to applaud, because all eyes were fixed on someone else standing on the podium. I had pushed myself to the edge for their recognition, but in my mother's eyes, I would always be the lesser child, a name that existed only to be compared, never to stand on its own. I still remember that winter morning when the phone rang before the sun was up. My father needed to be rushed for heart surgery at a major hospital in Colorado Springs. No one else, I was the first one my mother called. I grabbed my coat and bolted into the freezing dawn. Snow blanketed the highway, the wind lashed at the windshield like 1,000 knives, but I drove more than 100 miles, eyes fixed on the blurred lanes ahead. Every time the tires slipped a little on the ice, my heart leapt, but one thought drove me forward: get him to the hospital in time. I sat 6 hours in a cold corridor outside the operating room, drinking a cup of coffee that had long gone cold without noticing its taste. Daniel was in Houston, busy with surgeries of his own. Emily was in Chicago with a case, both sent short texts, "Hope it goes well." And me, the lesser child, I was the only one there, clutching my bag, my heart pounding with every footstep of the doctors passing by. No one asked how far I had driven, what I had abandoned at work, or how I swallowed the fear in those 6 endless hours. And then came the SUV. I still keep the first text my mother sent, only a handful of words: "I need your help." The old car broke down. That was it, no explanation. I said yes, out of habit. And from then on, for 2 years straight, I transferred $1,800 every month, a sum so large I had to cut down on everything. I gave up dinners out, stopped buying new clothes, moved from an apartment with a balcony to a cramped one that could barely fit a bed and a desk. Some nights I sat in front of my online bank account, watching the words "payments successful" appear, breathing out a shaky sigh, knowing I'd scrape by again on the scraps left in my account. Meanwhile, my mother drove that gleaming SUV to parties with her friends, flaunting a new handbag, her face lit up as she bragged about Daniel's successes and Emily's victories. Not once, not ever, did she mention me. That car became the perfect symbol of my place in the family. I was the invisible engine paying to keep it running, but when it rolled proudly down the street, no one cared to look back and see who had fueled it. Emily called me late one night, her voice hoarse from crying as she tried to keep herself composed. "Sis, I have no other way. The bar exam fee is $3,500, and I can't come up with it. If I miss this exam, everything I've worked for these past years will go to waste." I sat silently in my dark apartment, the glow of the computer screen casting light on the numbers in my account, money I had set aside for emergencies. I knew perfectly well she had just spent the entire summer traveling across Europe, spending recklessly, and now she was back, begging. I wanted to refuse, to tell her it was her responsibility, but when I heard her sob through the phone, "If I don't have you, I have no one," my heart clenched. I typed in the numbers, confirmed the transaction. Instantly, $3,500 vanished from my account, leaving behind a cold emptiness. Emily sent a short text, "Thank you, I promise I won't forget." Weeks later, I saw her post a picture online, smiling brightly with her law books, captioned, "The future starts now." No one knew that behind that smile were nights when I ate instant noodles for dinner and cut every expense just to make up for the money I had sent her. Daniel was different. That pain cut even deeper. My golden boy brother, the surgeon everyone praised, was drowning in student loan debt. When the loans neared default, my mother called me, her voice both pleading and commanding, "Jessica, your brother can't let this get out. It would ruin his reputation. You have to help him, just this once." I sat frozen in front of my screen, staring at the $5,000 I had saved over 3 years. I had pictured it countless times, the down payment on a tiny apartment with a balcony where I could grow a few pots of flowers. That dream was the only thing that made the coldness of my family bearable. But with one click, it was gone. I remember my chest tightening, my palms slick with sweat, but I still did it. Daniel never knew. He still sat proudly at family dinners, listening as my mother bragged about his successful surgeries, soaking in the praise of everyone around. No one mentioned the person who quietly paid off that debt, no one noticed that to keep his perfect image intact, I buried my own smallest, most fragile dream. I sat at the far end of the table, forcing a smile, feeling like I had erased my own existence just so someone else could keep shining. After 7 relentless years of work, I finally touched the title I had chased since my internship days, marketing manager. Those 7 years were filled with nights I stayed behind alone in the office, harsh fluorescent light falling over the keyboard, projects revised until the letters wore thin, and weekend mornings when I quietly skipped outings with friends to finish a campaign. I was used to my family brushing off my accomplishments with a dismissive, "That's fine, I guess," but when my director announced my promotion, I sat there stunned, torn between tears and laughter. Not because of the pay raise or the new title, but because for the first time in years, someone saw me, really saw me, and acknowledged that I was good enough. The feeling spread like warmth through my body, soothing cracks that my family's neglect had left behind. Not long after, Brian took me to the Grand Canyon. I thought it was just a getaway, a chance to breathe and forget about work for a while. But that afternoon, standing at the edge of the cliffs, the sun blazing red as it sank behind the vast stone walls, the wind whipping my hair into a frenzy, Brian turned to me, his eyes strangely solemn. He knelt down, pulling a small box from his coat pocket. I saw his hands trembling, but his voice was steady as he opened it to reveal a simple ring, no flashy stones, just a luminous band. He had spent $4,500 on it, not to flaunt wealth, but to tell me I was worthy of something lasting, eternal. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his words carried by the howl of the wind, echoing through the canyon. I choked up instantly, tears spilling, because never in my life had I been placed at the very center like this. I nodded, and in that moment, the Grand Canyon was no longer just a natural wonder, it was the place where I knew I was chosen, loved, not for what I sacrificed, not for what I carried, but simply for being me. For the first time in many years, I felt as if I had stepped out from the invisible shadow my family had placed on me. The title marketing manager was not just a new position, it was proof of all those nights I worked past 2 or 3 a.m., of all those weekends I declined invitations to finish a project, of every time I swallowed the sting of being compared to Daniel or Emily. The day I got the promotion, I walked out of the office later than usual, passing the lit-up buildings in Denver's cold wind, and for the first time in years, I smiled to myself. No one in my family knew, but I knew, I had done it. And when Brian knelt down in the middle of the Grand Canyon, as the fiery sunset poured over the cliffs and the simple yet elegant ring gleamed in his hand, I trembled not from the cold wind, but from emotion. $4,500 could have bought something more extravagant, but he chose a ring that was fitting, modest, and enduring, just like the way he chose me. He didn't promise me heaven, didn't paint extravagant dreams, he only asked a simple question, "Will you marry me?" And in that moment, I knew someone truly saw me, not as the faded shadow standing next to the celebrated children, but as a whole person. All of this ignited in me a fierce hope that made my chest tighten. This Christmas would be the first time I walked into my parents' house without feeling small. I pictured the moment I would share my promotion, place the ring on the table, and my mother's eyes would finally light up for me, not for Daniel or Emily. I imagined my father smiling with pride, relatives raising their glasses in a toast, and in that familiar room I would no longer have to sit shrunken at the corner of the table like every year before. I had waited my whole life for this, to be recognized by my family as someone of value, someone worthy of pride. And inside me, a fragile but growing belief took hold that this Christmas could be the chance for everything to change. That house in the Denver suburbs glowed like a scene from a Christmas movie. Snow piled thick outside, but inside, each window pane spilled warm golden light from strings of bulbs my mother had draped across the porch and along the white fence. The living room was lavishly decorated, with a 9-foot tree standing proudly in the corner, red and gold ornaments twinkling in the lights, and the old silver star on top still shining just as it had for decades. The smell of cinnamon, baked apples, and butter drifted through the house, mingling with the cheerful carols playing from an old speaker, making me feel both at home and suffocated at once. I walked in carrying the boxes of gifts I had spent weeks preparing. I had chosen each one carefully, as if every gift was a message I wanted to send. For Daniel, a high-end leather suitcase with his name engraved inside, I knew his career as a surgeon meant constant trips to conferences, and I wanted the gift to remind him he had a sister who noticed even the small details. For Emily, I made a thick photo album, compiling 10 years of family memories. I had spent night after night at my old laptop, scanning faded photographs, arranging them in order, adding small captions on each page, so that when she opened it, she would see that I had always been part of this family story, even when they chose to ignore me. And for my mother, I hand-knitted a scarf in turquoise. I remembered her once saying that color matched her eyes, and I held on to that. I spent a month patiently stitching each loop, hoping that when she wrapped it around her shoulders, she would feel a bit of my warmth. When I placed the gifts under the tree, my heart pounded, not because of their monetary value, but because of the naive hope that this might be the year I finally saw recognition in my mother's eyes, heard a sincere word of praise, or simply received a smile meant for me. I had poured into those gifts not just time and effort, but the desperate longing to be remembered, to be seen, to be touched by the love I had always craved. In that moment, as the golden lights reflected off the shimmering wrapping paper, I truly believed this Christmas could be different. It took my mother less than a minute to turn my anticipation into mockery. Her eyes swept over the red dress I had chosen so carefully, one I had tried on again and again in front of the mirror to look both festive and elegant. I thought red would make the room feel brighter, would make me stand out for once. But she only frowned, her voice cutting sharp as scissors. "Jessica, that dress looks cheap. How many times have I told you, red does nothing for your skin? Look at you, you look completely out of place." Her words fell like stones thrown into water, sending ripples of shame through my body. I forced a smile, but my palms were damp with sweat, the fragility in me laid bare before everyone. Then she turned to Emily, her eyes lighting up, her voice suddenly sweet as though nothing harsh had just been said. "Now look at her, that $800 dress, so elegant, so refined, exactly what a successful woman should look like. Emily, you really know how to make me proud." Emily tilted her head slightly, a satisfied smile on her lips, her fingers brushing her hair as if to showcase her beauty even more. She didn't need to say much, the whole room was already on her side, all eyes drawn to her. Daniel sat there, eyes glued to his phone, fingers scrolling endlessly. He didn't look at me, didn't look at our mother, as if he were completely detached from what had just happened. Emily gave a faint smile, making no attempt to contradict or defend me, because she was so used to being the favored one. And the entire room was silent. Not a single person spoke up to say my mother's words were cruel, not a single voice rose to object, not a single sympathetic glance was sent my way. They all sat there, unbothered, as if watching me being humiliated in front of everyone was so normal it wasn't worth mentioning. I sat still, my hands clasped tightly together in my lap, forcing my face to remain unchanged. But inside, every word my mother had just said felt like a knife reopening an old scar, sending a dull ache radiating across my chest. I had thought I was used to this, that after so many years I'd grown immune to her treatment. But familiarity didn't lessen the pain. It only made me feel like I was trapped in an endless loop, where I would always be the one pushed to the sidelines, dragged out as the shadow that made others shine brighter. I had planned this moment for weeks. When the clinking of silverware finally subsided and the chatter at the table fell into a brief silence, I took a deep breath, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I smiled, trying to steady my voice. I have something I'd like to share with everyone. After 7 years of hard work, I've been promoted to marketing manager. The last words escaped me like a cut of release, carrying with them all the pride and the buried resentment I had held for so long. I had dreamed of this moment, the chance to prove to my family that I wasn't useless, that my efforts were worthy of recognition. For the first few seconds, the room was dead quiet, as if everyone was weighing whether my news carried any real value. Then a few relatives began clapping, the sound not thunderous but enough to make my throat tighten. Those small sounds were what I had longed to hear, tiny but soothing to my wounds. My father set down his fork, placed his glass of wine aside, and his eyes lit up with a pride I had rarely seen. He leaned toward me, his voice warm and full of emotion. "I'm proud of you, Jessica." Those words echoed through me like a gentle melody, making my hands tremble, because I had waited my whole life to hear something that simple. My grandmother, sitting at the corner of the table, her white hair glowing under the golden lights, nodded slowly. Her eyes were moist as she smiled at me, a tender, patient smile that revealed all her love. Just in that look, I knew she saw the quiet battles I had fought, the years of comparison and dismissal I had endured to stand where I was now. Her recognition, silent but profound, felt like the warm embrace I had been denied for so long. But when my eyes sought my mother's reaction, the joy inside me plummeted. She sat there, calm to the point of coldness, cutting into her turkey as if she'd just heard something trivial. No words of congratulations, no smile, not even a glance in my direction. Only silence, heavy, suffocating, crueler than any insult she could have uttered. I could hear the faint clatter of silverware echoing in the room, and in that silence, I realized that even when I gave everything, my mother could extinguish my fragile pride with nothing more than a cold glance. In the very moment I should have felt recognized, I slid back into the familiar darkness of being disregarded. When I finished announcing my engagement, the whispers around the table quickly faded, the atmosphere sinking further. I clutched the ring box in my hand, trying to hold onto the fragile warmth from my father's smile and my grandmother's trembling hand. I hoped for a few more words of congratulations, a few gentle looks, but then my mother set down her fork and knife, lifted her head, her sharp eyes cutting through me. She spoke slowly, her voice not loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Jessica, I have to say it. You are the most useless child I have." The air shattered instantly. The Christmas music from the living room suddenly sounded distant and hollow. I heard someone's breath quicken, then the clatter of silverware falling onto a plate, but it all dissolved into the pounding in my chest. Heat rushed to my face, while the hand clutching the ring box turned ice cold. I looked around the table and saw stunned faces, a few relatives gaping, Daniel finally looking up from his phone in shock, Emily frowning but staying silent. My father shook his head, his lips parting as if to protest, but no words came out. My grandmother furrowed her brows, her eyes blazing with a rare fury. I sat there, stunned, as if all sound and sight around me had been pulled far away. In my ears, only her words echoed, over and over, like a verdict carved into stone. The most useless child, those 3 words reverberated in my head, squeezing the breath out of my chest. All the years of effort, all the silent sacrifices, reduced to 4 words my mother hurled in front of everyone. I felt stripped bare, laid out on a table with my humiliation dissected, no protection left. The chill of those words cut deeper than the icy storm outside, leaving me frozen in the room that should have been filled with the warmth of reunion, but now was smothered by silence like the aftermath of a storm. In the middle of the dinner table, still steaming with turkey and laughter only moments before, my mother suddenly put down her fork and knife, lifted her head, and delivered the cold line, each word dropping like heavy stones. "You are the most useless child I have." The once cozy room seemed drained of all its air. The sound of Christmas music from the living room still played, but in my ears it warped into something distant, meaningless. I sat frozen, my hands stalled over the ring box I hadn't yet put away, my whole body locked in place like ice. For a split second, I thought I had misheard, that such words could never have come from the very woman who gave me life. But when I looked around the table, I knew I hadn't. Silence blanketed the room so heavily I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. A few relatives glanced at one another, their eyes a mix of shock and confusion, as if they couldn't believe something so cruel had been spoken on Christmas. Daniel, the brother who rarely looked up from his phone, lifted his head, stunned. His face had gone pale, his lips pressed tight, unable to form words. Emily, usually so coddled, frowned slightly, her eyes darting between our mother and me, unable to hide her unease. For the first time, perhaps they both realized the brutal favoritism I had endured. As for me, my cheeks burned hot, my heart pounded violently, but my hands were ice cold. Her words drilled into my chest, turning my fragile joy into ashes right in front of everyone. I felt not only humiliated, but exposed, as if I had been dragged out into the center of the room to be mocked in the very home where I was supposed to be loved. And in that silence, I understood that no one here could erase the wound her words had carved straight into my heart. I sat paralyzed, feeling as though my whole body had been nailed to the chair. My ears buzzed, every sound around me reduced to a dull, heavy hum. I scanned the table, saw stunned faces, confused glances, but not one person spoke. Not one. In that moment, I felt like someone marched out to the gallows, and my mother's words were the first swing of the axe. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. My fingers clutched the small ring box, trembling with every ragged breath, as if even it knew the dream I had dared to cradle had just been brutally extinguished. Then, from that paralysis, a different tide rose within me. I felt it clearly, a fire flaring up beneath the ashes I had buried for more than 30 years. Every time I had stayed silent so my mother could go on praising Daniel. Every time I had swallowed tears so Emily could be shielded. Every sacrifice I had never mentioned, afraid of being called boastful. All of it, every piece, every wound, surged into my chest and erupted. I heard the scrape of my chair against the floor, the sound sharp and violent, tearing through the suffocating weight in the room. Heads turned instantly. Daniel's eyes, for once, lifted from his phone in rare surprise. Emily flinched, biting her lip, unsure of what to do. The relatives stayed quiet, as if watching a play that had suddenly erupted into its climax before they were ready. I stood tall, gripping the edge of the table to steady my voice. But in my eyes there was something even I had never seen before, resolve. I locked eyes with my mother, her gaze still glittering with familiar contempt, and for the first time in my life, I didn't turn away. I didn't bow my head. All the humiliation, pain, and resentment that had built up over the years coursed through me, forming into a single current. Tonight, I will not be silent. I clenched the phone in my hand, my chest rising and falling with fury and anguish, and turned the screen so everyone could see. The numbers glowed starkly on the white background, cold and clear as indictments. My voice shook at first, but with each word it grew steadier, heavier, echoing through the room that had only moments ago been filled with laughter. For the past 2 years, every single month, I've sent $1,800 to cover the SUV my mother drives to her parties. Yes, that shiny new car everyone praises as stylish and classy, it runs on my money. I cut corners, gave up the smallest pleasures of my life, just to make sure those payments were never late. And in all that time, not once did my mother acknowledge it, not once did she say thank you. I drew a deep breath, my throat tightening as I moved to the next point. $4,200 for Dad's heart surgery. That day, I sat 6 hours in a freezing corridor, my chest seizing with every passing minute. And where were Daniel and Emily? Busy with their brilliant careers. It was me who drove him there, me who emptied my account to keep him alive. And yet, what did everyone keep talking about afterward? Daniel's talent, Emily's success, while I remained invisible. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice wavering between anger and grief. Then there was Emily. She called me sobbing, begging for $3,500 to sit for the bar exam. I knew perfectly well she'd just blown money on a summer trip to Europe, but I still sent it. Why? Because I thought if she achieved what she wanted, Mom would be happy. I thought maybe then she'd stop looking at me with contempt. But what happened? Emily passed, and Mom bragged about her to everyone. And my name was never even mentioned. I paused, took in a shaky breath, and forced out the final blow, and the last $5,000, the money I saved over 3 years, the money I planned to use as a down payment for a small apartment, my only dream of having a place of my own, gone, just so Daniel wouldn't default on his student loans. He sits there, still hailed as the successful doctor, while I bury my dream of a home. All of it, just to protect this family's perfect image. I lifted my head and looked around the table. The room was silent. Relatives stared at their laps, Daniel had gone pale, Emily bit her lip, and my father sat stunned, unable to speak. I fixed my gaze on my mother, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and panic, but I didn't tremble anymore. For the first time in my life, I made them see every dollar, every scar, every sacrifice I had carried. And I knew that after tonight, no one could ever again pretend I had done nothing for this family. The room was so silent it was as if all the warmth of Christmas had been sucked out in a single instant. The lively music in the living room now sounded distant, hollow, irrelevant to the crowded kitchen thick with tension. I stood tall, my eyes locked on my mother, and said the words I never thought I'd have the courage to say: "The Bank of Jessica is officially closed as of today." The words rang out, firm and solid, striking the table like a gavel. I heard someone suck in a breath, the clatter of a spoon hitting a plate, and then absolute silence. I turned to my mother. She sat frozen, her lips pressed tight as if searching for an excuse, but her hands trembled. The face that had always been confident and cold cracked, revealing something I had never seen before: confusion. My father turned to her, his eyes wide with both shock and disappointment. He slowly set down his glass of wine, his voice rough, as if choked. "Margaret, how long has this been going on? You let our daughter carry all this, while you kept saying she was useless?" I had never seen my father like that, his voice no longer calm, but trembling with restrained fury. My grandmother, who had been quietly watching the entire time, now leaned forward and braced her hands against the table. Her voice was raspy but rang out with strength, slicing through the dead air. "Enough, Margaret. I've sat here and listened to you humiliate Jessica for years, but tonight it ends. This girl has carried more for this family than everyone else at this table combined. If she is useless, then tell me, what do you call useful?" Each word fell sharp as steel, striking the table like a second gavel, making several relatives flinch, unable to raise their heads. Daniel sat frozen, his face pale, unable to meet my eyes. He knew, and he could no longer deny, that the debt that had once weighed him down had been carried by me. Emily stared at her lap, twisting the hem of her dress, her lips pressed tight. For the first time, the pride etched permanently on her face dissolved, replaced by something that looked like shame. Both of them, so used to basking in the glow our mother cast, now sat paralyzed, speechless. I scanned the room, my chest feeling as though it might burst, but not from pain as before. This time, it was release. The words I had spoken shattered the heavy shell of silence that had suffocated me for years. I no longer had to hide, no longer had to endure quietly. And seeing them, my father questioning, my grandmother defending, my siblings struck mute, I knew that for the first time, the truth had put me in my rightful place, no longer a shadow, but a person with a voice. My father was so stunned it seemed as though his entire face had frozen. He sat upright, both hands trembling on the table, his fingers tapping in time with his frantic heartbeat. I had never seen him like this, his eyes wide open, stripped of their usual calm, replaced by genuine shock. He turned toward my mother, his voice rough, heavy with every word. "Margaret, is it true? What Jessica just said, is it true?" The room was utterly silent. Every eye was fixed on my mother. Her lips moved as if to form words, but nothing came out, her eyes darted around as if searching for something to cling to. For the first time, I saw a crack in her, the pride she had carried for so many years now trembling at its foundation. Her silence was her answer. And in that silence, I heard my father's heavy sigh, a sound laden with all the years he had looked away, all the times he had stayed silent. Then came Daniel. He sat frozen, his fork slipping from his hand and clattering against the plate, the sound sharp enough to sting the air. His eyes bore into me, wide, as if for the first time in his life he was seeing me not with indifference, but with stunned disbelief. His face went pale, his lips trembling. "Jessica, you did all of that for me?" His voice cracked, as if he was afraid of the answer. I looked straight at him, my chest tight with emotion, but my voice came out firm and clear. "Yes, Daniel. That student loan debt you thought our parents had handled, it was me. $5,000. Money I spent 3 years saving, money I hoped to use as a down payment for a small apartment of my own. My dream of a home disappeared, just so you could go on being praised as the pride of this family. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists, veins standing out against his pale skin. I saw his shoulders tremble, and for the first time, the arrogance that had always lived on his face fell away, leaving behind a man stripped bare, bewildered, and shaken by a truth he had never considered. The praise, the medals, the adoring looks from our mother, all of it suddenly weighed heavy, false, in that moment. In the crushing silence, I could hear the rush of blood in my ears, even the faint, broken whispers of a few relatives. But above all, I saw Daniel slump in his chair, his face drained of color, his eyes clouded with panic. For the first time in his life, he had to face a truth no one had ever said aloud. The glory he wore was built, in part, on the sacrifices I had paid for with everything I had. Emily shot up from her seat, her eyes wide, her voice pitched high and breaking in panic. No. That's not true. She's making it up to make herself look important. Mom never made Jessica carry all that. She always plays the victim. Don't believe her. She spoke frantically, her hands trembling as she grabbed for her water glass and nearly spilled it, desperate to hold on to the authority she had always been given. I looked at her, and in her eyes I saw not only denial, but fear that the safe wall she had always lived behind was collapsing before her eyes. Then came the scrape of wood against the floor, stretching the already suffocating air taut as a wire. My grandmother stood up, her frail frame suddenly commanding, her eyes blazing, her face set with authority. She planted her trembling hands firmly on the table and spoke, her voice hoarse but ringing, each word slicing through the thick air like a blade. Enough, Emily. Jessica is the pillar of this family. Not you. Not Daniel. And certainly not anyone who only takes from her sacrifices without asking if she could bear it. She has carried everything, while you two have been coddled, praised, and never once asked what it cost her. The room was dead silent. My grandmother's words fell like hammers, smashing through the false facade my mother had built for years. I saw a few relatives flinch, some faces flushing with shame, the earlier whispers extinguished completely. Daniel lowered his head, his hands clenched so tight they turned white. Emily stood frozen, her lips moving but unable to form words, her eyes wide like a child ripped out of a sweet dream and forced to confront a bitter truth. And my mother, the woman who had always carried herself with cold, unshakable pride, sat stiff, her eyes darting wildly. I saw her lips quiver, trying to form words but failing. No, it's not like that, it's not true, you're all misunderstanding. Her voice broke, fragmented, no longer a command, no longer a judgment, but a weak, stammering protest. The image of the powerful matriarch I had known all my life crumbled right there, before me and everyone else. The room was wound tight like a string, everyone holding their breath as if the slightest touch might snap it. But unlike all the times before, I was no longer the one sitting with my head bowed in suffocating silence. I stood there, my chest rising as if it could finally expand, my eyes burning bright in the storm, and for the first time I saw that the truth was no longer buried. It had rung out, clear and undeniable, through my grandmother's firm voice, and now no one could ignore it. I walked out into the biting cold of Christmas night, the thick snow falling on rooftops mingling with the frantic pounding of my heart. The car door closed behind me with a dry thud, severing me from the house I had once believed was my safe place. The road lay before me, blanketed in white, the streetlights casting lonely streaks of gold. My hands still shook on the steering wheel, but inside me surged something new, a feeling both empty and light. After years of being chained in silence, I had finally stood up and spoken it all. Before I could start the engine, my phone vibrated violently. Mom lit up the screen again and again, not once, but 5, 6, 10 times in a row. I gripped the wheel tighter, letting the calls ring out. Then the texts began pouring in. First came the familiar accusations, "Come back right now. You're making a fool of yourself in front of the whole family. Do you want to humiliate us?" I stared at the words, pressing my lips together. Minutes later, the tone shifted. "Please, Jessica. I didn't mean it. Don't abandon me, don't let everyone think I'm a terrible mother. Come home, we'll talk privately." Accusations and pleas tangled together, like ropes thrown to drag me back. But I didn't answer. For the first time in my life, I let the ringing die, let the messages flash and disappear. That silence was the answer I had never dared to give. The next night, as I sat motionless on my small sofa, the weak yellow light falling over unopened gift boxes, the phone rang again. This time it was my father. I hesitated for a long time, my finger trembling over the screen, and finally I answered. On the other end, his voice came slow and heavy, stripped of its usual calm. "Jessica. I'm sorry." I froze. Those 3 words, from the man who had stayed silent all his life, who had never once stood up for me, landed in my ear like something unreal. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice breaking. "All these years, I thought silence kept the peace. I thought if I said nothing, things would stay steady. But I let you carry it all alone. I let you be belittled right in front of me, and I didn't protect you. I truly regret it." I closed my eyes, tears spilling hot down my cold hands. Inside me was still anger, still hundreds of wounds unhealed, but those words, that admission, reached the deepest part of me I thought no one in the family had ever seen. I couldn't forgive him immediately, but I knew one thing for certain: the moment he said "I'm sorry" was the first time in my life I felt truly heard, truly seen. Not as the quiet shadow behind Daniel and Emily, but as a human being with worth, with pain, with a voice. And that, even if late, made my heart tremble with the strange joy of finally being recognized. When I decisively cut off the flow of money leaving my account for my family, a space suddenly opened before me. At first, the emptiness unsettled me. For so many years, I had grown used to watching my balance drop at the end of the month, drained by something tied to Mom, Daniel, or Emily. I had thought it was my duty, the only way I existed in the family. But when my banking app displayed the same number after the billing cycle, my heart shook, not with fear, but with a profound relief. The money I kept began to take on a new form. I opened a savings account and named it Future Home. Just seeing those words, I felt like I was stepping further out of the faded shadow my mother had cast over me. I transferred a few $100s each month, and for the first time, instead of emptiness, I felt joy spread through me. I knew I was nurturing a dream that had once been buried by unrecognized sacrifice. I also allowed myself small joys I had always cut away to have more for others. I bought a big armchair, deep green, and placed it by the living room window. In the mornings, I sat there with a hot cup of tea, the winter sun filtering through frost on the glass, and felt a peace I had never known. I bought a thick coat, warm enough that I no longer shivered each time I stepped onto snowy streets. I bought a new set of blankets, so at night I no longer curled up tight to save on heating. These little things, to me, felt like rebirth. And most importantly, I realized my mind had changed. I no longer jolted at midnight when the phone rang, no longer held my breath waiting for a desperate message to arrive. I no longer stayed awake through the night calculating what to cut from food or clothes to cover the next demand. The invisible burdens that had weighed on me for so long simply dissolved, leaving behind a lightness that felt almost foreign. I began to sleep deeper, my dreams no longer filled with running or scrambling for money. One afternoon, I sat in my small apartment watching the snow fall outside the window and suddenly realized I was no longer living in fear. In that moment, I felt hollow inside, but it was a gentle kind of hollow, making room for hope, for love, for a future that for the first time I knew would be mine. I cut off the financial support to my family as if cutting away a rope that had been strangling me for years. At first, I still flinched at the end of each month, waiting for the familiar notification, "Automatic payment has been processed," to flash across my phone. But instead of seeing my balance drained for bills that weren't mine, the number stayed intact, untouched, as proof that I had finally reclaimed ownership of my life. The feeling was both strange and trembling, like learning how to breathe again with my own lungs after years on life support. I began gathering small amounts, carefully moving them into a separate savings account. Then one snowy evening, Brian and I sat at the little kitchen table, opened the laptop, and created a joint account. We named it our future. We both deposited the first sum, not a large one, but to me, it was sacred. When the words "transaction successful" appeared, a wave rose inside me. This money was no longer draining into bottomless pits, it was flowing into a future I truly wanted to build. Brian placed his hand over mine, gave a gentle squeeze, and I knew he felt it too, that from now on, I would never be alone. The change showed itself clearly in my work. No longer did I have to interrupt a presentation to answer desperate calls, no longer did I lie awake calculating how to scrape together thousands for someone else's emergency. My mind was finally my own, and that energy made me soar. I walked into meetings with new confidence, my thoughts sharp, my ideas abundant. The campaigns I led succeeded one after another, colleagues sought my advice, clients spoke my name with trust. My career path stretched wide open, no longer held back by the invisible ropes of my family's demands. On late nights, I sometimes sat alone in the empty office, looking out at the city lights flickering through the glass, and caught myself smiling. For years, I had worked under suffocating pressure, under my mother's sighs, under the endless requests of my siblings. Now it was different. Every drop of sweat I gave, every project I finished, was for me, for my life, and for the future I was building with Brian. I was no longer an ATM machine named Jessica, but a woman standing firmly on her own feet, strong and free. 6 months after that stormy Christmas, Brian and I were married in a small chapel in Colorado Springs. That morning, the golden sun stretched across the distant mountains, the breeze drifting through pine trees carrying the scent of wild grass and damp earth. It wasn't the lavish wedding many dreamed of, no fleets of luxury cars or banquet tables that stretched for yards. Only those who truly respected me were there, the faces who had stayed beside me even when my family turned away. My grandmother sat in the front row, her gentle face glowing in the sunlight pouring through the chapel windows. A few close colleagues who had seen me from my late nights at the office to the day I stepped into management. Old friends who never demanded I prove my worth in order to deserve their love. My father was there too. I hadn't been sure he would come, but when I saw him standing, a little stiff but with warm eyes, I felt peace settle in me. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider at my own milestone. I walked down the aisle in a simple ivory dress, Brian waiting at the end, his eyes brimming with faith. When my hand touched his, I knew I had finally stepped out of the old shadow and into a new chapter. After the ceremony, my father unexpectedly stepped up to the small podium. He looked around, as if to make sure his words would be heard by everyone. His voice rang out, no longer hesitant, but strong, steady, and deep. My daughter has never been useless. She is the heart of this family. The room fell silent. His words blew through me like a strong wind sweeping away the dust that had weighed on my heart. All the years I had waited, all the times I thought I'd never hear them, had finally come. My grandmother's eyes brimmed with tears, her head nodding over and over as if she had been waiting her whole life to hear her son say those words. A few colleagues turned to smile at me, clapping, and Brian squeezed my hand tighter, his eyes shining with pride. I broke down in tears. Not because the pain was reopened, but because for the first time, I felt myself placed in the position that should have been mine long ago. The tears falling onto my wedding dress did not shame me, they were proof that I no longer had to steel myself, pretending to be strong. I stood here, in front of everyone, no longer the faded shadow of Daniel or Emily, but a whole woman, loved, acknowledged, and seen. And in that small space, under the golden sunlight, I felt free for the first time in my life. My father had spoken for all the years of silence, and his words closed a bitter cycle, opening a new path for me. A path where I no longer had to pay with my own existence just to keep others standing tall. As the wedding ended, I stood quietly, gazing out at the Colorado mountains stretched beneath the golden afternoon light, my heart lighter as if I had finally put down the burden I had carried all my life. I realized I had at last found happiness and freedom, not the fragile happiness that depends on my mother's approval, not the forced freedom of silence, but true peace in knowing I no longer needed to live for recognition. All I had ever wanted could be summed up in one simple thing, to be seen and loved for who I truly am. And it turned out the way to that wasn't through exhausting myself trying to prove my worth to those unwilling to acknowledge it, but by setting boundaries. I learned that by respecting myself, I also had the right to choose who was worthy of staying in my life. Standing there amid the golden light and genuine laughter, I spoke words that felt like a vow to myself. From now on, I will only keep around me those who know how to cherish me. It was not a challenge, but a calm, resolute declaration, closing a long chapter of hurt and opening a new beginning. And what about you? Have you ever had to speak a painful truth to your own family? Share your story in the comments. And if you see yourself in mine, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so that others too can find the strength to stand up for themselves.